We dare not complain about the sunshine, just making sure that it is not washing me out. Is this okay? All right. I keep figuring out where to put me. Well, today's Bible story is well known mostly for its ability to inspire memes and jokes and one-liners. Like the sign in the liquor store on the wine shelf that said, "Jesus was here." Or the meme that gets passed around saying, "Does anybody know which page of the Bible explains how to turn water into wine, asking for a friend?" Or the joke, "Jesus turned water into wine. Everybody admires him and talks about it for 2,000 years. I turn water into Mountain Dew at the subway and everyone calls it stealing." So the story that Jesus turned water into wine is somewhat common knowledge, although the details of the story may be quite a bit less familiar. When you think about it, it is rather an odd story for the Gospel of John to set the tone for Jesus' ministry. It seems to be a bit quirky, kind of irrelevant. Jesus is a guest at a wedding. When they run low on wine, Jesus' mother pushes him to fix the problem, so he almost begrudgingly does, but in a kind of extravagant way, provides 6 large jugs holding at least 120 gallons of the very best wine, long after any wedding guests are paying attention to the vintage. To our contemporary ears, it can all sound a bit frivolous, excessive, or even wasteful, which doesn't really match our notions about Jesus, and certainly doesn't set a tone for his ministry that makes any sense to us. Not to mention that it is a story that comes out of time. In January, in Manitoba, it is hardly wedding season. We're focusing on extreme weather, from frigid to melting to stormy, which is at best inconvenient and at worst dangerous. We're surrounded by political discord and tragic accidents. The idea of partying in general feels a bit insensitive. And I gotta say, I'm not sure I want to celebrate excessive alcohol in a context like ours, where alcohol overconsumption is a source of pain and addiction that turns lives upside down. And further afield, yet not so far really, we know that part of our world is literally burning with out-of-control wildfires, where no one wants water to be anything but water, because even plain water is pretty hard to find. And that's true in more places than we even want to think about. I do think that what you hear in this story depends a great deal on what is happening for you. Your life circumstance sort of gives you a lens through which you view the story that really impacts your interpretation of it. For example, if you celebrated a Christmas engagement and you're planning a summer wedding, I wonder if this story makes you want to go check your bar order list. Maybe it just wants you to makes you want to recheck your invitation list and make sure you invite some problem solvers for whatever inevitable wedding disaster lands on your doorstep. On the other hand, if you're having a disagreement with your mother right now, I can imagine you might focus in on that relationship between Jesus and his mother. Even Jesus and Mary sometimes had different perspectives on the situations. You might also notice that whether he agreed or not, Jesus did what his mother asked, which might not be entirely comforting if you're struggling to communicate with your mother. The theologian Chung-Hyun Kyung said that Mary is key to this story, because what we see in this story is her raising Jesus to practice compassion. And I really do like the idea that we see that Mary, through her whole mothering of Jesus, was teaching Jesus that hospitality and compassion are never a waste of time. I think it's easy in the face of turmoil when the world offers you circumstances you'd rather not deal with. When your first response is, really, why me, why now? To retreat into your own needs. To build walls around yourself of grief or work or anxiety, or even that it's not really my business philosophy for protection. And if that's all you can do, then God will sit with you and invite others to surround you with the compassion and the grace. God will encourage you to open yourself up to receiving the care of those around you. And if that's not all you can do, if you are a friend or a neighbor, or simply someone who notices a need like Mary, God will nudge you and invite you and push you to share. In this story for Jesus, Mary is that nudge. Of course, when we come to this story, we still might be wondering about God's priorities. Running out of beverages at a party hardly seems like a problem worth worrying too much about, depending on the burdens that you are carrying or trying to carry. I think it's hard for us to understand the shame that running out of food or drink carried in ancient cultures where hospitality was a matter of life or death. See, if you couldn't host others, then you couldn't depend on others to host you in what was often a hostile and perilous environment. And the fact that the community had not arrived with food and drink enough to share and fill the gap in this case, was kind of a failure of neighborliness, which back then, when the resources were few, it mattered a whole lot. I've been wondering lately if that's more true for us than we realize. Certainly, we understand how much neighborliness matters to us when we come up empty. I suspect that many of us have at some point felt like we had a lack of resources to deal with whatever life was handing us at the moment. Our shortfalls are many and various. They could be financial, or in health, or in patience, or energy, or community, or compassion, or hope. Any number of ways that we can feel ill-equipped for whatever life has placed in our path. And maybe you are so deep in the feeling of disaster that really you could just use a miracle, and are wondering how or when or whether it is possible for God to ever show up for you. And if that's so, I wonder whether you hear this story with a sense of hope or deep suspicion or cynicism or a bit of all of it. When we wonder where God could be, it seems to me that we are often looking for some particularly obvious sign that God is with us. A blinding light, perhaps. A brilliant idea. Something that will dramatically change our circumstances for the better, like a lottery windfall or an unexpected cure. But this isn't that kind of miracle story. Oddly, Jesus himself seems to do really very little. He doesn't hold his hands in a particular way. He doesn't say any magic words. Mary gives instructions to him. He gives instructions to others. And the others do all the work of preparing the jars and filling them with water and serving what's inside. And then we only know that something has happened when others start to taste what is now apparently pretty good wine. While this story is often described as Jesus' first public act of ministry, there's very little that is very public about it. There's no press releases, there are no thank you speeches. In fact, a relatively small number of people even know that anything out of the ordinary has happened. It is not obvious. The hosts never even know there was a problem that got solved. The wedding couple are not apprised or not involved. Most of the party guests have no idea. It is in sharp contrast to a news item I caught the other day when the Coca-Cola Company presented a single commemorative bottle of Diet Coke to the US president-elect for the upcoming inauguration party this coming week. It struck me that this is kind of exactly the opposite of what happens in the Bible story. Because this was a big show and tell presentation by the CEO of the company to present a single bottle that will not be on sale to the public, a limited number of which will be given to the White House to share with only the specialist of guests. And I was just struck by the contrast to a Bible story where behind the scenes, with no fanfare, enough quality wine is poured that it will be available not just to the top tier guests, but everyone at the party, even in the cheapest seats, with no labels and no need for credit. Interesting. Perhaps the way that God changes situations from ones where there is nothing left to ones where there is overwhelming abundance is always kind of a group effort. Neighborliness matters when we are feeling empty. And maybe you're most likely to notice the transformation only if you're an active participant. I noticed that in this miracle, anyway, Jesus merely helps people do things they didn't really know they were capable of doing. He asks people for help. And then he invites a few to see the presence of God among them, and there's a miracle. I have been thinking a lot about the stuff that happens behind the scenes, because isn't that where things that matter usually are? Sometimes we talk about miracles as if they're magic. So what matters is what we see out on the surface. But what if the difference between miracles and magic is that the miracle isn't what the world sees? The miracle is what is invisible to most. Centuries ago, I think it was St. Augustine who would say, you know, God makes grape juice out of rainwater year after year after year, but we're so used to it in the vineyard that we don't notice a miracle. Which kind of takes me back to where I started with this story. What you see in this story depends on the lens you're willing to bring to it. And maybe part of the point of the story is that our perspective on life depends on where we place ourselves in it. If we are expecting God to show up to our disasters and our emptiness with flashes of light and obvious displays, we might be disappointed. If we go into Jesus' story expecting that we can fan follow him the way we do with the rich and famous or the YouTube influencers, we might be disappointed. Instead, the glory of Christ will be revealed in things like love and service and community and grace. That's what the presence of God looks like, in case you're having trouble seeing it. I noticed that the Gospel of John has no birth story about Jesus, and yet those birth stories we've been hearing through the Christmas season have such a parallel to the way that John starts his story. Big is not a synonym of great. Small is not interchangeable with insignificant. Those who notice the miracles might be the ones we think of as nobodies. Cana was a backwoods town off the beaten path from anywhere. Even today, scholars are debating still where that real Cana may have been. It was no place for Jesus to begin. But perhaps that is always part of the point. The storyteller in the book of John says this is the first of Jesus' signs. And like a billboard or a jumbotron, a sign is not as important as what it says. I wonder if the storyteller does not want us to get too fixated on the water or the wine that we miss what it's trying to point to. So where does the story point you? Does it point to the importance of cultivating the health and well-being of neighborliness around us? Does it remind us that God is not so much revealed in flashy things, but behind the scenes, by those who are putting in the work, through things like, what was it again? Love and service and community and grace? Is it trying to prepare us to understand the story of Jesus as a source of extravagant and abundant grace for ones who feel sometimes like invisible nobodies, who wonder if maybe the world has given up on them? Does it nudge us out of our comfort zones to participate as much as we can, asking for help and giving help so that we can discover the joy in the midst of sorrow and struggle that can feel like emptiness? I heard once that just like the wine in this story, we are mostly water. We are water plus a miracle. Pretty clever. Well, like all signs, we can give this story a pass without giving it much notice. Or we can let it point us in a direction, which may not be exactly where we thought we were headed before we heard it. Then again, if we follow the direction, we might just find ourselves being filled up by others and in an overflowing of grace. Wouldn't that be a miracle? Thanks be to God. Amen.